Hi, so my name is Mike Goodwin, and I work at Sage in our CTO office for our global CTO. My focus is on building some fairly innovative and early stage technologies, but also closely related to that, I work on our overall strategy for product data. So that's the data that our customers put into our accounting, our payroll, and our HR products. And for this session, I'm going to talk for about half an hour about how we approach developing that strategy, that product data strategy, looking at some of the inputs that we used and some of the outcomes that we're trying to do with it. So just by way of context, I'll just share some information about Sage that's relevant from a data strategy point of view. So for the most part, our customer base is small and medium-sized businesses, although we also have a fair number of larger enterprises too. And in terms of numbers, we have millions of small business customers and hundreds of thousands of medium or larger size ones. We also operate in the payroll space, and about 30 million people worldwide have their salary paid by Sage software. That includes about 8 million in the UK, which is approaching a quarter of the UK workforce. So obviously we do operate in our UK, which is our home market, but we also operate across North America, in Western Europe, South Africa, and also the Middle East. So in terms of data volume, I mean, as you can imagine, we have quite a lot of it in our products. So there's billions of invoices, hundreds of millions of payroll records. I mean, really quite large amounts of it. But also, as well as the volume side, the quality of the data that we have is typically very good. So if you compare it to the data that you might get from, I don't know, click streams of websites, for example, I mean, typically our data is usually quite high quality. And the reason for that is that our customers use it as the basis for their sort of regulatory tax and other submissions. So the consequences of errors in the data can be quite high, as it says on the screen there. It says that people can go to jail if they do the wrong kind of submission. So naturally, the data there is quite good quality. And just to be clear, in terms of scope, what I'm really talking about here is the data that sits inside our products. Katie Ward, my colleague, is on. I saw her on the chat earlier. She's on a panel later on. I think probably she'll take a wider perspective of other data that we have in the business from our our own finance systems and CRM systems, etc. I'm kind of focusing on the product data for the purpose of this talk. So given the volume of it and given the quality of it, the inherent quality of it, I mean, our conclusion is that there's value in the data, but as a business, we've not really capitalized on that so far. I think it's fair to say. So we have been active in some acquisitions, and we've made some investments to build our capabilities, but I would say it's relatively experimental so far. However, what we've learned from those experiments and combined with other research and thinking that we've done have really solidified our convictions around the value of the data, and our data strategy really is designed to move us from a position where we have this data as an asset that we haven't capitalized on to one where we'll really be able to extract the value that we strongly believe is there. So I think just one thing to sort of set the scene before I get into some details is that the way we formed our strategy, obviously, it wasn't created in isolation. So it was a result of combining the existing technology vision that we've had for a while in the business, together with a kind of analysis or observations around external factors or macro trends, as we refer to them, that we've seen in our market and in the wider world, together with a set of guiding principles that kind of come from our purpose as a business and the values that we have as a business. So they were the inputs to the strategy. And the result was, and that's the left-hand side of the diagram. And the results were, the outputs were kind of what's shown on the right-hand side. It's a set of high-level ambitions. So these are the kind of top-level objectives that we have, together with a set of fundamental enablers, these key success factors that we need to put in place And they're a mix of technical and organizational type things that will enable us to achieve these high level ambitions that we're talking about. And the screen, what's on the screen here, is pretty much the agenda for what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about each of them in turn, starting with the inputs. So it's in terms of the kind of external view of the world, then these macro trends. Like many sectors, I mean, we're in our sector, we're experiencing quite a lot of disruption, both from existing businesses. So banks are starting to offer bundles of services beyond traditional banking, which touch on the areas that we think of as our turf or our sort of traditional areas of strength. So we're seeing new business models for existing businesses, but also new business models from newer starters. Often these newer companies start from a relatively narrow starting point, so they might have a very specialized applications or services based on expense management, for example, but they're a little bit like banks. They're kind of extending into a wider set of business processes and touching on the areas that we've seen as our kind of strength or heartland. So that's like trend number one. We're also seeing that over time that some of what we would describe as the sort of traditional value or the capabilities that we've built into our applications over the years are essentially they're receding in value, and the value shifting more into capabilities based on the data that these services are built on. So the most obvious and simple example of that is that manual data entry used to be a important characteristic of accounting products. We put a lot of focus on it over the years, but that's being displaced, or in some cases has been completely displaced by automation. So that's no longer offering any value really, and instead, the value is shifting to how can people get insights from the data. And again, the most obvious example of that is advanced analytics based on the data we hold. But there's many more examples of it than that. And then finally, in terms of the business models, new business model side of things, it's quite common we see, and especially common for businesses with very high valuations, that the business models that they're using are based on data network effects of some kind. So a good example of that is Bill.com, who have a very, very high market capitalization. Last I looked, it was around over 13 billion on a revenue, which is really very small for compared to that. And I think the reason for that is because the model they have is based on network effects, and that gives them a lasting competitive edge, which is quite difficult to break down. So they're the kind of business model trends. On the technology front, obviously there's the continuing rise of cloud computing capabilities. So the capabilities that you can get from people like Amazon and Microsoft and the others continue to get better and better. The cost of these services continues to go down and down. It's an ongoing trend. Strongly linked to that, there's the fact that artificial intelligence and machine learning is now something which is within reach for much smaller businesses nowadays than it used to be. And really, it's over recent years, it's gone from a kind of specialized thing to being much more mainstream now for smaller companies. And then lastly, on the tech side, we're seeing wider adoption of decentralized ledgers. So I'm thinking of kind of blockchain stuff, not necessarily in terms of cryptocurrency, or well, not really in terms of cryptocurrencies, but from our point of view, we're more interested in the trust or the confidence in data that's generated by things like distributed ledgers in scenarios where data has been shared from one party to another, so from one business to another, a supplier to a customer, or a customer to a supplier. That's kind of, I think for us, or for me anyway, it's a kind of more interesting aspect of that whole branch of technology. And then lastly, on the regulation side, obviously there's a growing awareness of privacy issues in society as a whole. These things are much more commonly in the news nowadays, on Twitter and other places than certainly they used to be. And that's probably, I think it's probably true to say that's stronger today in the consumer space than in the business space. But our research suggests that that's transitioning really to businesses as well. And people have the similar types of expectations around privacy, around security. Everyone's aware of GDPR and other regulations, so other countries are following suit. So in California, they fairly recently introduced privacy regulations. Other countries are ahead of the UK and the EU in terms of their approach, or more stringent maybe in their approach. That's a continuing trend. And then sort of related, that we're seeing more and more that governments and other groups are pushing, and in some cases mandating, open standards around data. So a really good example of that is open banking, where banks are forced by regulation to expose their data in a particular ways. That's likely, we think, to be built on in other areas. And then there's government strategies around things like digital identity, where they include measures to essentially intended to improve access to services and access to data to kind of power the digital economy. So that's sort of the external view of the world, which is like the driver. This is like the thing that's causing us to want to take some kind of action. Looking more internally, we have in Sage already a technology vision that's been established for quite a while now, and it's summarized in sort of 2 phrases on the screen there. So the first point, our customers are at varying stages of digital transformation of the businesses. Some are quite early on, but some are much further along. And our sort of the first goal of our vision, or the first pillar of our vision, is to help our customers to continue and accelerate that digital transformation. And in terms of the second part, the digitization that we're talking about, often it comes with a lot of automation, a particular automation of low value work like data entry that I mentioned before. So a second part of our technology vision is to equip our customers with tools and with insights and capabilities, so that the time that they're saving through automation can be used to do much more high value or elevated work instead. So this is what we mean by elevate the work of humans. So when we looked at this, it seemed very obvious to us that a data strategy should be able to complement both parts of this vision really well. Our data strategy is not really causing us to change our vision. It's very complementary to the vision that we already had. And then, so if you think about the trends, they're sort of like a push for us, and the vision is sort of like our destination. What we added to that is a set of guiding principles for data, and they themselves derive from kind of our purpose as a company and the values that we have as a company. And so if the trends and the vision are kind of like a why are we doing something, and a where do we want to go, the vision's like well, how are we going to get there? What kind of route do we take? Because obviously there are many ways we could try and do these things. Now I'm not going to go through in detail all of these things, because to an extent they probably won't be a surprise to you. And in fact, some of them, you could argue, some of them are not really values or principles that are mandated by regulations, certainly as far as personal data is concerned. So I'm not going to go through each of them, but I did want to focus on just one of them, so the customer benefit one, and give a couple of examples of how that shaped our thinking, just to illustrate and bring it to life a little bit. So here's a few examples. So the first one, in our data, we sort of represent a lot of customer supplier relations, a sort of digital network of millions or billions of kind of relationships. And also it includes things like stock and what these businesses do. And we've thought about from time to time whether we should use that to build a sort of supplier search. So if you wanted to buy baked goods from somebody, maybe you can get that from our kind of network. But the principles, I think, would steer us away from that, because basically our principles are saying to us that our aim is to help all of our customers be more successful, and a kind of ranked search in this way, while it would be fantastic if you were the top of the search list, it would be a bit disastrous if you're on page 2, because I don't know about you, but it's a long time since I've been to page 2 of a Google search. I maybe never go there nowadays. So a ranked search in that way would essentially be favoring one customer over another, which is, I don't think personally aligns with our principles. So it kind of steers in that direction. Similarly, our approach to open standards. I mean, we have to recognise that our customers, well, we're obviously have quite a large number of customers. A lot of our customers interact with other companies that are not our own customers and that use our competitors' software, and we have to sort of embrace that and support our businesses through making those interactions better and more streamlined, regardless of whether they're dealing with Sage businesses or not. So the way to do that really is by embracing open standards and open networks and data portability, rather than by trying to create closed environments. I mean, certainly we need to create competitive edge and differentiation, but not through closed standards and proprietary standards. And then lastly, and our focus is on unlocking value for our customers from their data and from aggregated data with other customers, but with the right focus on privacy and data ownership and control. We're not, I think, going to be in the business of selling data or even database services to third parties unless there's some clear customer benefit in there. Now, this all sounds like quite altruistic, but it doesn't mean to say that we wouldn't monetize any of this stuff. And in fact, when we add value, we would expect to get rewarded and paid for that. But I think it does require us to think, well, to be able to clearly articulate the value to our customers in any kind of new business model or any use case that we're evaluating, rather than simply focus on a kind of purely on a revenue opportunity for us that doesn't really benefit our customers. So that's that's not in depth, but that's just a few examples of how the principles that we have will shape the outcomes or the outputs we want from our data strategy. So that's a summary of the input side of the equation. So I'll talk now about where this led us to in terms of outputs. And it's as I mentioned, it essentially falls into two things. So there's a set of high-level goals, and there's a set of I call them on here key success factors, but they're kind of enabling foundational things that we also need to have in place to enable the ambitions that we have. So in terms of the ambitions, first of all, I mean, firstly, and obviously, it's to deliver ways to let our customers unlock the value and the power that their data holds. I've got a couple of examples of how we would do that in a sec, but both of the examples touch on some of these other ambitions as well. So I'll cover them first before I kind of go into the examples. I mean, one of the big ways that we're going to create value for customers, I mean, the biggest way, actually, probably by a long way, is through AI and ML. But there's also lower tech ways of doing that. So I mean, I say more traditional analytics, but also just simply exposing or making data accessible in easier ways is a good way we can unlock value. And one of the examples I've got is directly about that. The middle column there, so the connect and enrich. When I mentioned network effects already, and our data, it represents a network of business relationships, but it represents it in a kind of implicit way. And what do I mean by that? So, I mean the connections are there in the data, but they're sort of like abstracted away or obscured by the model that we have, the tenancy model that we have in our products, where we tend to support customers looking inwards at their own businesses rather than outwards at the way they relate to other businesses. So that means that it's quite difficult for these connections to be queried or examined and used to deliver value. So one of our kind of main ambitions is to make those implicit relationships much more explicit. So map the relationships out explicitly in data and then use them to deliver value. A big technical aim for us. Now we have a lot of data, as I mentioned, it's quite rich, but we can make it more so by blending it with other data. So this enrich the customer data, allow us to create more value. So for example, there's official data from things like Companies House that we can use to categorize our customers based on the industry sectors that they're in, for instance. Or we can use data from the invoicing networks or other things like this. Now, it kind of sounds quite obvious that if you enrich data that it's going to be more valuable, But for us at Sage, I mean, it represents a shift in mindset from a position where data, previously we would view it as a byproduct of our products. So it's something we have to have in the product in order to do the regulatory submissions. Or even, I mean, even worse than that, sometimes we view it more as a risk. So there's a security risk there, there's risk of data breach, there's risk of privacy breach. So we almost view it as a kind of negative thing to be minimized. And this idea of kind of investing in the data and enriching it and curating it is a shift in mindset for us to think about data as an asset that we invest in and that has value beyond the features, the existing product features that it directly supports. That's quite a, as I say, it might sound trivial to you, but it's quite an important mind shift for us, where we're starting from. And then the last column there is about trust. So obviously that includes trust in Sage. So if we're expecting people to let us do more things with their data, then obviously they have to trust us. And particularly in the context of these wider privacy concerns that are becoming more prominent in society, that has to be more than just a page on a website saying you can trust us to keep your data safe. We have to demonstrate to people that they're in control of the data, that they own it, they can exercise that ownership both in terms of using it where they want to, but also making sure that it's not shared without their control, it's not shared without their knowledge, and they can revoke any kind of access whenever they want. So we have to create really positive stories around data ownership and privacy, rather than just say that we're going to do it well. And then, so that's about trust in us, but in terms of trust in data, so I talked about the quality of the data that we hold, and generally speaking, people have trust in it. But a lot of the use cases that we're talking about with data now involve sharing data with third parties in one way or another. And when you get data from somebody else, the trust that you have in it, or the confidence that you have in it, obviously is reduced because you're not as aware of the kind of provenance or integrity of that data. So I mean, part of our proposition, if we want to support these sharing use cases, we have to find ways of maintaining that trust when the data is shared with, between different parties. So I'll move on to examples, and they touch, the first example touches particularly on this this question of trust. So just a quick summary of it, and this is an example of a kind of low-tech use of data. There's nothing particularly fancy in here. What we're looking to do is essentially to digitize the process of credit applications. So today, if you're applying for any kind of loan, by the way, I kind of found out in the research around this that there's over 50 million loan applications of one sort or another in the UK each, or credit applications in the UK each year. And if you kind of cross-reference that with the fact that approximately a quarter of the UK workforce is paid by Sage software, that makes a kind of quite large, potential addressable market for us. So basically, we're looking to digitize that process where today, if you're trying to get credit, you might take a paper copy of your payslip, you'll give it to the lender, and they'll use that as part of the decision making about whether to give you a loan or not, whether it's affordable for you or not. Sometimes they might follow that up by checking with your employer. So our aim is to digitize that whole process with an online one. So that benefits our customers, obviously, because they won't have to have any kind of processes or resources around to do the verification of these things. So if a lender will contact them saying, please, can you check this? They don't have to support that because it will all be online. It benefits the employees because they get easier access to credit, and they get, to an extent, they get better privacy because their employer doesn't need to know that they're applying for a loan. Maybe they don't want their employee to know that. And from a lender perspective, it reduces fraud risk. And it reduces fraud risk basically because we expect that we are a more trustworthy source of the data than a paper payslip that today, obviously, it's very easy to mock up a payslip with a fake salary. So that's the kind of most obvious thing. But from a trust point of view as well, because we have the richness of the data that we have covers a lot of different business processes. We can use that to increase the trust in from a lender's perspective, increase the trust even more. So for example, we wouldn't share salary data with a lender unless that was consistent with what the company had published to HMRC. So we're basically using HMRC as a way of we're not stating that the pay data that we're sharing with the lender is correct, but what we are saying is that it's consistent with what somebody's told the government, and that makes it much less likely that somebody would try and get a fraudulent loan by setting up a fake sock puppet company in our payroll software, giving themselves a bazillion pound salary and trying to use that to get credit they didn't really they weren't really entitled to. That's an example of both unlocking data for the benefit of the people that own the data in a quite low tech way, but also increasing the trust by cross-referencing the data that we have against other uses to that data has been put to. And the value for Sage in this basically comes from the lender. So there won't be any charge for this for our customers. There'll be no charge for employees. The lenders will be are willing to pay, from their perspective, for the increased confidence and the reduced fraud risk that they'll get from this. So every verification that they do of salary will be paid for. And the last point on it is just in terms of positive stories around data ownership. The employee in this scenario remains in control of the data throughout. So typically today, with payroll software, that your employer actually usually has more control and visibility and access to the data than you do as an employee. And this, to an extent, this is kind of correcting that inequality there. But it's also, in this case, the employee has to explicitly grant permission to a lender every time they want to access the data. So they're very clearly in control of it. And this is the way we realize these positive stories about data ownership that I mentioned. So another quick example, we call it a general ledger outlier detection. GLOD is the not very pretty acronym we use for it. What this basically is it's a machine learning service that uses it does an analysis for historical transaction patterns, and then uses a model a machine learning model that is derived from that to evaluate current transactions that have been approved, and flags any transactions that it sees that deviate from the historical norm, whatever normal is. So basically, it learns what normal is for a particular company, particular customer of ours, and then when it sees transactions that are in some way outside of that normal, it will flag it. So the benefit here is it allows our customers to proactively catch errors before they really find their way into their accounting system. Essentially, it scores these transactions, and then if the score exceeds a threshold, it will flag it for manual attention. And again, this touches on, in terms of our ambitions, it's obviously it's use of ML, so it's a so it touches on that. Again, it touches on confidence in data, because as a result of this, the number of errors will be significantly reduced. It's not been launched very long. In fact, some of these numbers are a bit out of date, but it's detected already thousands of errors which possibly would have got through into the accounting system without having this in place. So it's an example of using ML and the data that customers already have in their products to make them more efficient as they go forward. So very much capitalizing on this, unlocking the value in data. And there's many more examples. I'll stop with those two, but they just hopefully give you a couple of like a low tech and a high tech example of how we're realizing some of these ambitions. So this is the last part really then. So I talked about the inputs. I talked about the ambitions. So the last bit is these success factors, or these enablers we have to have in place to enable the ambition. So, and I just kind of run through them. So firstly, like most companies, we're very aware of data security and privacy considerations. I'd say since we're early on really in the life of our data strategy, I would say it's fair to say that our governance around data and data access is much more oriented around security and privacy risk and minimizing that than it is around enabling innovation and enabling agility. So, I mean, put it bluntly, it's quite hard for teams to get access to data to do the kind of modeling and data science work that kind of underpins the ambitions we have. So one of the things we need to do, one of the first things we need to do is, without compromising on privacy and without compromising on security, which is obviously very important, we need to have more streamlined processes that let teams innovate faster, get access to data to allow them to innovate faster, and to iterate these ideas in a much more agile way. That's kind of number one, and maybe the most important thing for us. The second point, technical foundation. So I mentioned already that we've made some acquisitions already in the machine learning and AI and data space recently, and that's provided us with I would say a good technical and skills foundation to build from. I would say it's concentrated though today in sort of centers of excellence. So we have some very strong capabilities around the business, but it's very uneven, and we need to continue to build on those centers of excellence and coordinate across the kind of different centers that we have, but also use those to transfer data skills and data literacy more widely across the rest of the business. So they're a platform both in terms of skills and in terms of a technical platform that we can build on. The third point on brand, I mean, our brand research tells us that we're a trusted brand, which is obviously a good start. We need to extend that though to be much more explicit, I think, about privacy and data ownership. This is directly reflecting the fact that we're doing more with data at the same time as privacy awareness is growing. So we need to up our game around our brand and how we message and demonstrate that, and the proof, the brand proofs that we have around privacy and data ownership. And then linked to that, the terms of service that we have for our products we need to make sure that they give us the flexibility that we need to develop the solutions that the strategy is calling for, but again, not compromising on brand trust. So we don't want to, for example, we don't want to have kind of terms buried that make it not clear and transparent that on the kind of things that we want to do with data. We want to make it very explicit and obvious to people. So on the next point about open standards, I mean, historically as a company, we've been not active really in terms of the development of open standards. We've been much more of a consumer. So we consume the open banking APIs, but we didn't really influence the development of them. I think that as they extend more into areas where we're kind of, I would say, more central, we're looking to, and we are now more active in the evolution of the standards. So we work with industry bodies like FData that are interested in broadening out the essentially open banking APIs to cover much more wide domains of data, and also with the UK government. So the government are interested. You might have seen it in promoting digital ID as a way of powering or invigorating the digital economy, and we were involved in their consultations around that. So we're kind of upping our game really to try and influence these standards to make sure that they, in the end, they serve our customers well, because we're going to, as I mentioned earlier on, we're going to kind of commit much more to implementation of them. And the last one is a bit more of an kind of internal thing really. It's about, I call it here on focus on product APIs and approaches for data ingestion. Really what I'm meaning there is that we need our engineering teams that are responsible for products to start having a product mentality around data. So today they would be, I would say, much more focused on capabilities, and it's not something that's kind of front of mind for them to think about, okay, how do I expose this data for internal consumption, for AI and ML pipelines. So we will implement APIs for third parties to use, for sure. I mean, we've done that for a long time, but less so for this kind of internal data availability. So the point of that last success factor on there is we need to have a mind shift to a product mentality for data as a core part of the engineering team's responsibilities when they're thinking about a product. Alongside the features, the user experience, the security, the quality. We want data availability to be front of mind. So that's more or less it, really. So just in summary, I mean, obviously, data is the oil of the 21st century. So we recognize that data is becoming a much more significant part of our world than it has in the past. We need to and that's kind of our driver, really, for thinking more explicitly, more strategically about data. When we're building our data strategy, it's not a technology thing. It's not a thing that we've done in isolation. We tried hard to fit it very much into the overall company purpose and the vision that we have as a company, so it becomes part of our business rather than any kind of bolt-on. The outcome of that has been a set of high-level goals, and we've got kind of benchmarks that allow us to judge whether or not we're succeeding in the achieving of these ambitions. But also, it's identified some key foundational building blocks that we need to put in place now. I mean, some of those are, as you saw, are organizational, some of them are more technical, but we need to look quite broadly, we think, to make sure that we're planning ahead, having the skills, having the technical platforms, having the business processes in place, so that we don't we don't run into barriers when we're trying to achieve the goals. So that's how we've approached data strategy so far in Sage. Thank you for listening. I think there's quite a bit of time left still for questions, so hopefully there'll be some. Otherwise, though, if you want to contact me to talk about any of this stuff, my details are on the screen there. I'm usually happy to talk about it. I mean, if you talk to any of my colleagues, I'll tell you it's usually more difficult to get me to stop talking about it than start talking about it. So always very happy to do that. So I just have a quick look at the so does investing in your data change your decision-making approach on managing your data model, from Julie Fitzgerald? It certainly does, and as I mentioned, I mean, our kind of approach around data has been almost one of cost minimization. So we sort of see many people view data in a kind of purely negative way in the business, but it's just cost, it's just risk. We are significantly shifting that, so that we need to think in a much more sort of strategic way about how we structure data, about the kinds of data that we bring in, we actively seek to bring in to extend and enrich things, and very much in how we structure the data in terms of typically our data is focused on capability, might be kind of strongly relational data structures in order to support the product features that it needs to support. And we need to think about a much more flexible way of storing and structuring data. So an example is we're kind of very interested in graph databases for the representation of these digital relationships, and that leads you to a very different way of thinking about how you would structure data, and you structure it around the kind of anomaly cases that you might want to spot, rather than just around the kind of expected structures that you expect to model. Julia, I hope that answers your question. And then the next one from Stuart: should digital ID be limited in its use or scope for a specific purpose? So do you meaning the kind of general digital ID, I think? So I'll answer it that way. So yes, I mean the scheme that the proposal that the government are working on is not a kind of government-owned single mandatory digital ID for everybody in the way that maybe Estonia has, where you get, I don't think it's tattooed onto you, but you get issued a digital certificate when you're born, essentially. It's not like that at all. What they're expecting is they're expecting to implement a set of standards and a governance model around digital ID, so that as a consumer, you can trust the people that are operating these identity schemes. The people that are consuming them can also be trusted, and you have some kind of recourse if something goes wrong. So in their model, it's not going to be mandatory to have any ID at all, but you can have more than one. So if you might want an ID which is for the purposes of buying a home, or one that you use for interacting with the government, for doing your tax or benefits stuff. And their expectation is that there'll be different schemes which have some kind of interoperability and common standards around security and privacy and other things like that, but they're operated separately essentially by the private sector in kind of cohesive industry sectors. I haven't seen that press release, but I have seen the government's digital strategy for access to government services. I didn't know it was a bit well Scott Logic though. That's good. Okay, well listen, thanks very much. I think we're out of time, so thanks very much for listening. And as I say, if you want to speak to me about any of this stuff, I'm happy to hear it.